Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm Julia Cutler, and I'm excited to be joined by career executive coach and author Tammy Gooler Loeb. Welcome, Tammy. We're very excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Julia. It's a pleasure.
Great. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience, and then we'll learn a little bit more about our guest. There will also be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please click the comments question button below the video to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Also, as a reminder, the recording will be available tomorrow. Now, to properly introduce our guest. Tammy Gooler Loeb is author of Work from the Inside Out, Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career that Fulfills You. She inspires people to build careers that are fulfilling and meaningful. Over 2 decades, Tammy has shared her expertise with audiences and clients, focusing on career transitions, networking, leadership strategies, and team development. Tammy hosts a weekly podcast, Work from the Inside Out, showcasing inspiring stories and practical lessons of noteworthy professionals who made transitions to more satisfying work. Her expertise appears in publications such as Harvard Business Review, Ascend, Forbes, Fast Company, and the Boston Globe. Tammy holds a BA in psychology and an MBA. Welcome, Tammy, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. So, work from the inside out, managing uncertainty and creating meaning. So, the question that I like to ask is why? Why do people choose the kind of work they choose? How does it fit into their lives? Does it make them happy? Does it fulfill them? Is it meaningful? These are the kinds of questions as a career and executive coach that I love to ask. I've always been fascinated by this. And it's something that I've always been in search of for most of my career. When I was about 40 years old, I found coaching, and I've never looked back since. But prior to that, I tried a whole bunch of different careers and professions, and many of them were very satisfying and fulfilling until they weren't. And so it's just been something that I've always been in search of, and I've been trying to help other people find their way to various careers and livelihoods that would provide them with more fulfillment, satisfaction, and meaning. So when we think about these things, it's important. And we want to go over a few things before we move along. I want to just share a few objectives with you, what we're going to try to do here today. We want to identify some of the common fears that keep people from pursuing more satisfying occupations. Many of us, as we move forward in our lives, we start to acquire other responsibilities. We get deeply ingrained in our professions, and it gets harder and harder to make changes. And there are certain fears that come up that can stop us, sometimes even paralyze us. We start to develop certain doubts about what we can and can't do. We develop limiting beliefs. Sometimes those happen very early on. And so we want to talk about how can we develop more positive reinvention strategies and develop more ongoing or sustainable career satisfaction. You know, we spend the better part of our adult lives at work, more time than we do with our families, more time than we do sleeping, and other priorities in our lives. So why shouldn't our work lives be more satisfying, fulfilling, and meaningful? At least that's the way I look at it. So I want to help you to understand, how can you empower yourself to act when fear might feel a little immobilizing? Now, fear can be very, very sneaky. We're going to get into that a little bit, and we're going to look at strategies for how to build self-confidence, manage your expectations, and strengthen your networking so that you can at least explore what options you might have. But let's take a look at how we work. So Fred, let's start with a poll.
It is started.
All right. So I can't see the poll. So the first poll I do know asks, how old were you when you had your first job? Some of us think of our first job as that job that we had when maybe we first got out of school. But many of us had jobs when we were kids. So what we're looking at is, what's our relationship to work? How long have we been working? So I'm curious to see. Let's see. So how old were you? So it looks like we have quite a few people who had their first job at a very young age. So before the age of 11 or 12, it looks like. Wow. 75%. That's amazing. That's great. All right. Well, we still have some people voting. Okay. So between the ages of 1 and 10, I don't think we're looking at 1-year-olds, but between the ages of 1 and 10, we have a small percentage of people who had their first job. I know my first job was ironing my father's shirts for $0.25 a piece. Needless to say, if you came to my house now and asked me where the iron is, I'd have to really think hard to find it. But it looks like the majority of people here had their first job between the ages of 11 and 17, so probably in their teenage years. Looks good. Looks good. So I think we can close out this poll, and let's go to the next one. So what was your first paid job? Did you do household chores like I just described, or yard work? I used to do yard work. I don't know that I got paid for that. Some people had paper routes or babysitting. Remember paper routes? Some people worked as camp counselors or did fast food work or worked in a store. And we have quite a few people who also put themselves in the other category. And if you have the opportunity to write in what your job was in the other category, I'd be very curious. I believe there's an opportunity to put that in the chat if you can, or in the comments. I'd love to hear what people's jobs were in the other category. I know in one of my past webinars, we had somebody who said her first job was as a talking mailbox at the shopping mall during the holidays. I thought that was kind of an unusual first job. So, circulation desk at a library. So George worked at a library for his first job. What an interesting first job. And learning about, I'm guessing, customer service then. Felicia. Ooh, you got $1 per shirt. Wow. I only got $0.25. Maybe I'm a little older. Softball scorekeeper. Nice, Fred. Farm chores, taking care of animals, and picking up rocks. Well, that was a good workout. Farm work. Juliet did farm work. Working bingo for a local church. Tricia. So different kinds of jobs. It's interesting to think about your first relationship with work. Thank you for sharing those. So let's now do our third poll. So do the math. Based on the age you started your first job and how old you are today, assuming that you're still working today, or if you're even semi-retired, whatever, how many years have you been working? Knowing that that first job was part-time, people sometimes don't count that early job, but in the context of what we're talking about today, I think it's important to think about your general relationship to work. You know, sometimes when people are even talking about things like volunteer work, they say, oh, well, that doesn't count. And I say it does count, because everything that you've done is experience. And people discount a lot of their experience and a lot of things that they've done that have actually built skills on all kinds of levels. So I'm always very, very curious to hear about different experiences people have had and the way that they don't include those things within their experience. And yet those things can be very valuable, especially if they're considering switching careers, moving into either a new industry, or even switching functional roles. And they discount those things quite a bit. So we have quite a range here, quite a range here of experience, and quite a few, at least 1/3 of the people here today have been working more than 40 years. So when you think about it, and over 60% of the people here have been working well over 20 years. So when you think about having several decades worth of work experience, from working at a circulation desk at a library, working on a farm, all kinds of different experiences, those add up over time. You get to take those with you from your youngest years onward, whether it's interpersonal skills, customer service skills, just learning about different environments that you've been in. And it doesn't matter how you got those jobs. I think people think, oh, well, somebody just handed me the job, so, I kind of cheated. No. That's not the point. So very important to think about the body of work that you've done all these years and how you take that with you going forward. People do tend to discount that. So this is great. All right, Fred, thank you so much for sharing these polls. This is really, really good information. All right. So when you think about it, we've got a group of close to 100 people here on the webinar today who bring a lot of experience and a lot of depth to the world of work. So when I talk about inside out, what do I mean? I named my book Inside Out. I talk on my podcast about inside out. I guess I'm kind of attached to that phrase. What does that mean? It means that inner voice, that gut feeling about something, when you've made a decision to go in a certain direction, whether it's a decision about work or a personal decision, and it just felt right. It wasn't necessarily even based on spending a lot of time analyzing something or logical thinking. It might be a hunch. It might be something that you can't even put your hands around. And then there are those times where you reflect back on a decision that you regret, or that you wished you had made a different decision. And you say, I wished I had listened to myself. I wished I had listened to my gut. I knew the answer and I didn't listen to myself. That's your inside. That's what I'm talking about. I think about how many of us growing up might have been good at something, or maybe a well-intentioned adult saw that we had a proclivity for something. Maybe it was math, maybe it was English, whatever it was, writing or reading, maybe it was sports. And people might have groomed you in a certain direction, and you took that direction. And or maybe you know somebody like this, and they reached a certain point, whether they were in their 30s or 40s, and they realized, I'm really good at this, but it's not really what I enjoy, or it doesn't fulfill me, or I'm tired of it. I want to do something else. That's an outside-in approach. That's where you get a lot of external inputs, or the people who very well-intentioned said, well, that's great that you want to be a poet or you want to be an artist, but what do you have? But now you have to get a real job. Now, I'm not suggesting that people go after work that isn't going to provide for their needs, but at the same time, when you ignore all the instincts that you have about what you would enjoy doing and just go after the things that are called real jobs, you're missing the boat. So there are ways to have both. And I'm not talking about having it all, but to have both. So that's what I mean by inside out, where we actually connect within ourselves in a genuine way and really listen. What is it that we really want? And we're going to touch on that a little bit more. So oftentimes it's fear that will drive our decisions, and it can be a friend or a foe. Chapter 1 in my book talks about this. Fear can be a foe because it stops us in our tracks. It stops us. It's, well, what if? You need to get that real job because, yes, you can enjoy this and that, but enjoyment isn't the goal. The goal is to put food on the table and a roof over your head. Yes, that's part of the goal, but the other part of the goal is you're spending the best years of your life working. How about finding something that brings some satisfaction too? That's my shtick here. Fear can also show up as a friend, and I'll tell you how. Think about those times where you come across something that really intrigues you. It really piques your curiosity. It's excitement. It almost gives you that jittery feeling, like you're curious. You want to find out more about it. It's so exciting, it scares you a little bit, but you're intrigued. You want to learn more. You're almost willing to take a risk to dip a toe in the water. That's where fear is your friend. And I can think of many times where I allowed myself to step over my fear, to explore something, to learn more about it, and maybe even to try it at the risk that it wasn't going to work out. And in fact, more often than not, when we try those things, they may not work out the way we hoped they would or the way we expected them to, but we always learn something. And sometimes they still turn out to be great, even if they didn't occur the way we expected them to. So it's important to pay attention to our fear response. We have that fight or flight response where that part of our brain called the amygdala gets triggered. And it makes us oftentimes want to run and hide or move in the other direction. That's what we have to pay attention to when that shows up, because that's telling us to protect ourselves, but it can also keep us in a stuck place. And I'm sure many of you have had the experience of feeling somewhat stuck in your career, or stuck at work, or stuck with a boss that you hate working under, or stuck in a corporate or company culture that doesn't suit you. So listen to that and then make a plan. It's not an overnight decision, and it's not an overnight plan to move on, but it can happen. So in chapter 2, I talk about it's never too late. And as I can see here, we've got a significant number of people here today who've been working at least 20 plus years. So I come across people all the time in my coaching practice who will say to me, well, it's too late. It's too late to start over. It's too late. I've put too much time into this career already, or I'm too old to go back to school. I'd have to go back to school to pursue that line of work that I kind of am really intrigued by. It's too expensive. I've got kids to put through college. I can't do that. So I hear that all the time. In the book, I tell stories of real people who actually did pursue new careers that they really wanted to do after the age of 40. I tell the story of a cousin of mine who was a teacher and then became a guidance counselor, and at the age of 50 went to law school. A friend of mine who was raising 3 kids decided she wanted to become a nurse. So she spent 2 years taking prerequisites, went to school to get her RN, and became a hospice nurse in her 40s. There are ways to make these things happen. Lots of different ways. But you do have to step over some of those fears and those voices that are telling you what's not possible. And I love the story. And then there's a third story of a client that I helped at the age of 58 take a career in software engineering. And he ended up translating that with his project management skills, working in the field of affordable housing at 58. And there's much more to that story if you are curious to read my book. So here's another one that really stops a lot of people. I have too many responsibilities. I mean, how many of us are in the sandwich generation these days? We have children, we have elderly relatives we might also be caring for. We've got a lot of responsibilities, a lot on our shoulders, expenses, all kinds of things. And we're in jobs that are supporting a lot of that. It's very, very difficult to consider the notion of stepping away from that to do something for ourselves. So again, I tell 2 really wonderful stories in this chapter about a gentleman and his wife who wanted to start their own business, a bread bakery. He had a corporate job, and they took 7 years to make it happen. So I think the other point I want to make is that these things don't happen overnight. They did it in a gradual way, and in a very fun way, actually. He took some of his vacation time and traveled and learned how to build a brick oven to bake bread in his backyard in Saskatchewan. I mean, we're talking, a lot of winter weather he was baking bread in. But they did it, and they ended up opening up a bread bakery in their town. And then I also tell the story of a single parent who had adopted an older child from a foreign country, and she had a successful career as an award-winning journalist, and she decided with her son that they wanted to move to a warmer climate. They were in the New York area, and they decided to move to Florida. And once they moved there, she came across a business opportunity and decided to buy the business. And it was actually something that had been a dream of hers for a long time. Now, again, this was a process over a period of a couple of years that she made this happen, but she did it as a single parent. And today, her son's in college. She's doing very well. And again, not without some bumps and scrapes along the way, but neither one of them has any regrets about what they did. So, these are things that people do make happen, but they do it in a planful way. And these are the kinds of things that I'm able to share in a realistic way. Another thing I think that stops people in their tracks is they have this mindset around, how do you form a career? You go to school, you pick a major, Maybe you graduate and you find a line of work. Maybe it's related to your major, maybe not. Many of us end up going in other directions. I actually did follow on my psychology degree and went into the mental health field early on. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people major in something and then end up going in some other direction. But then they think they have to stay on that straight line and then climb a ladder or move through some kind of linear progression. And if they reach a point where they decide, gee, I don't like this anymore, or I want to do something different, sometimes they start to entertain ideas that, oh, there's something wrong with me that I want to do something different. Or how am I going to do that? I don't know what I really want, but I know it's not this anymore. Aren't I supposed to want to just progress and grow in this area and stick with it most of my career? I mean, I'm at the lower end of the baby boomer generation. That's what we were taught. And I think people in my generation have even taught their kids to have those thoughts. And again, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with thinking that way, but I think that the world of work doesn't really work that way anymore. And so we have to think more flexibly about what's possible and what's available to us. So their careers are generally not formed in a straight line, and not everybody does just stay in one lane and climb a ladder. So it's helpful to think about what else is possible and how to get there. One way to get there is when you start to have those thoughts, listen to that inner voice that's telling you it's time for a change. The thing that most people don't realize immediately is, oh, maybe I just need more information. And so one of the most important things you can do is just start to ask some good questions and figure out, what is it that I need to know? Who can I ask, or where can I get more information? Rather than saying, I don't know what it is, so I'm just going to stay where I am. Almost like better to deal with the devil I know than the devil I don't know. And I see a lot of people who stay where they are, and then they get more entrenched, or they get more stuck. In chapter 5, I talk about don't default to what you're good at. I talked about that a couple of minutes ago, right? So I have a wonderful picture here of these two people smiling with their trays of bread. They're bread bakers. And I use this as an example because I love to bake bread. I love baking. And I'm pretty good at it too, but I wouldn't want to be a professional bread baker. And why is that? Because these people have to get up and go to work, probably at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. That would not be good for me. So as much as I love baking bread, being a professional bread baker would not suit me very well at all. So being good at something and enjoying it as your job might be two different things. So there are maybe things that you're really good at. It doesn't mean it's what you should be doing for your work. So that's another thing that I think I find a lot of people confuse. They'll say to me, well, I'm good at this. I could do that. It's like, sure you could, but would you be happy doing it? What are the other factors around that would make that a satisfying work situation for you? So these are important things to ask yourself. What is your definition of success? We often get ourselves stuck in a place where we think we know what it means to be successful, or we create an image of what success is. So we're going to do one more poll about this. I'm curious to hear what you think success is for you. There's no right or wrong answer here. So Fred, can we bring up that other poll question? Thank you. So what is one word or phrase that comes to mind for you when it comes to what success means to you? As we hold ourselves up to a standard of what we want for ourselves, and then we expect ourselves to meet with that. And if we don't meet with that, sometimes we get disappointed in ourselves. So it looks like the professional and family blended and balanced. I call it blended more often than balanced because I'm not sure as human beings there is any such thing as balance. When I hear people talk about work-life balance, I think, not really sure what balance is, but I know what we have to do to blend things to make them work. So that's just a phrase I often find myself using more is what's the right blend for you? And I see a lot of people are naming living life true to your own values. I am curious, those of you who chose other, if you're willing to share in the chat or the comments, what your definition of success is. And I know that when I hear people talk about success, sometimes they talk about success as if it's a point that you reach down the road. Some people are working on their success over time. So Angela says having a healthy mind, body, and spirit means success. And so that's something you can achieve over time, but you can also feel like you're having that in the moment as well, I would imagine. So there's lots of ways to look at success, aren't there? All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we can close out the poll. Thanks. Yeah, so I say success is not a destination. It's not something that you, and this again is my opinion, it's not something you just reach for down the road. I've seen a lot of people who work very hard for many, many years, even in a way of suffering for many years, to achieve something that they hope will happen down the road, rather than seeing what are some of the touch points along the way. I think many of you, the way you voted here, it sounds like you could see those touch points along the way. And so I think it's helpful to ask yourself, how is your definition of success serving you and your goals? And does that hold meaning for you? I also think that what we hold as success in terms of maybe how we were raised to look at it or how we thought about it in our 20s versus how we might think about it in our 30s or 40s or older, it changes over time too. But I think it's a worthwhile discussion and something that's worth thinking about because in this chapter, I share a few stories of different people who really gave it quite a bit of thought in terms of how they formed and shaped the pathways of their careers. Really interesting. One person in particular who developed his own consulting practice and made a very intentional decision not to do a lot of traveling, even though it would have made for a far more lucrative consulting practice. He decided to cultivate all his clients on a local basis. And if you read his story, you'd see that he has had a very, in his eyes and in mine, a very successful consulting practice and has an amazing life. So yet most people who do that kind of work end up traveling, barring the last couple of years, of course, but most people end up traveling and moving and having to place themselves with clients in other locations to get some of the bigger clients. he was able to make it work locally so that he could be at home every night having dinner with his family. And now he splits his time between his home here in Massachusetts and a second home that he has in Mexico. And he's also taken sabbaticals over the years as well. And that has not hurt his consulting practice. It's actually helped it, believe it or not. People told him he was crazy. And it worked. It worked. So it's interesting to hear how people, when they want to do something a certain way and they set the intention and they plan, they can make it work. So I want to point out something here about networking. A lot of people will make connections, develop relationships when they're looking for what's next, their next role, their next project. I have seen a lot of people, though, when they've landed somewhere, they often let a lot of those relationships kind of dissipate. Now, it's not intentional, but it often, because they get busy, it makes sense. But then maybe a layoff occurs or something else changes and they're looking for their next role. And they feel bad because they know they need to tap into their network again to start looking for the next thing. They need to learn about where there might be openings or what companies might have, might have gotten new funding and where there are opportunities. And they feel bad because they haven't talked to some people in a few years. Now, I work with a lot of people around this, and I think that there's lots of good reasons to network other than to look for the next job or even to talk about the next job as much as to share information and to also offer to help other people. This could be an entire webinar in and of itself. But my point here in this moment to you is to say, make sure that you keep your network alive at all times. It doesn't mean that you have to shake every hand and kiss every baby all the time. It doesn't mean that you have to keep every single relationship alive. But there are so many ways these days to at least touch base with people and at least let them know you're thinking of them. To keep in touch with people, it's very, very important. And to offer to be helpful to them is actually extremely important. I wish I had more time to go into that, but I just want to plant that seed. It's extremely important. The other thing that I see that holds a lot of people back from taking next steps is they're very concerned that they're not qualified. They read job descriptions and they don't see themselves fitting in. Oh, I don't have those qualifications. I don't have the number of years of experience, or I don't have this, I don't have that. And I want to say, apply anyway. There are so many reasons to go ahead and open yourself up to lots of possibilities. There are two stories in this chapter of two women who rose through the ranks of their companies without any college degrees at all and had very few qualifications. What did they bring to the table? Curiosity and an eagerness to learn. Wild eagerness to learn, wild curiosity, and employers who were willing to hire them. So you could say, well, they were just lucky. You could say that, but they showed up and the luck showed up too. So that's why I say apply anyway, because applying anyway means you're showing up. There are a lot of job descriptions that are written in such a way that that the company doesn't always know what they need in the moment. They've put a job description out there and then they start talking to candidates and then they realize what they really need. Or the job description isn't well written and they might see your credentials and your resume and they might show an interest in you. I've also seen lots of cases where they see your resume and they look at it and they say, you know what? We're not going to consider you for this role, but we have something else in the works and we want to talk to you about that. So there's always a reason to make yourself visible to a potential employer. So if there's something about that employer or something about that role that intrigues you, apply anyway. You have nothing to lose by applying other than a little bit of time. And uncertainty. The only thing about uncertainty is that it's certain. It's a fact of life. You never know what will happen. Life can change in an instant, unfortunately. I want to tell you a quick story about a friend of mine, Jenny Lisk. Jenny Lisk was a 20-year veteran project manager at IBM. She had 2 beautiful children, as you can see in this picture, and a husband. She was the chief breadwinner in her family. Her husband had a great job, but she was the chief breadwinner. Over the years, she was getting kind of tired of her work and really wanted to do something else. And she had considered doing a number of different things and started taking some courses and was getting restless. But there was always some other things tugging at her, all the activities with the kids and that. And she never could quite get her hands around stepping into another career. One day her husband comes home from work and he says, I'm feeling a little dizzy. And she says, oh, maybe you're just dehydrated, drink some water. The next day, he's not feeling any better. They go to the doctor. They do a scan. They find a brain tumor. He's on the operating table literally the next day. He comes out of the surgery and he's not the same person anymore because the surgery affected his cognitive abilities. And unfortunately, 8 months later, he passed away. It was a very aggressive tumor, similar to what Ted Kennedy and John McCain had. That experience that Jenny went through obviously changed her life forever. What she learned was that there were amazing resources available to her children. There were a lot of resources available for grieving children. There were a lot of resources available for widows, for grieving widows. What wasn't available to her and where she really felt a loss was, how do you handle being a widowed parent? And so she took it upon herself to develop resources and started a podcast called the Widowed Parent Podcast. She also had the opportunity to take leave from her job at IBM. They had offered, she lives in Seattle, they offered to move her to New York, and she didn't want to move to New York. So they gave her a package. And she took that time to develop this podcast and to develop outreach and an audience of other widowed parents. And then she also wrote a memoir, a really compelling and, believe it or not, uplifting memoir. And I'm going to close out with a quote from her memoir. She asked herself, when she was thinking about her husband losing his life, she said, he was 44 and he only got to live half his life. And she was looking at her life and saying, I still have another half of my life to live. So she asked herself, if my life is the same 5 years from now as it is today, would I be okay with that? And she said, if the answer is no, or especially if the answer is hell no, then now is the time to do something about it. And that's when she decided to take the time and develop her own brand and her own business. And she is now helping other widowed parents and wrote her own book. And she's also helping other independent authors too get their books off the ground using her project management skills. And on that note, I would like to offer all of you a workbook that I've developed. At the end of every chapter of my book, there are reflective questions and guiding activities that relate to the content of each chapter, so that not only am I sharing stories with you about people who have actually worked through some of these obstacles, but activities that you can engage in on your own that might help you think through what's next for you. I put together this workbook so that those activities could be available to you in a hands-on way. And then I added bonus activities. So you can access that workbook by going to tammygoolerloeb.com/workbook and get your own downloadable PDF of that workbook. That's my gift to you. Of course, I'd love it if you wanted to buy the book, but you can also download the free workbook as well as a PDF. And I want to thank you for listening today, and I hope this has been helpful to all of you. Love to take some questions.
That was great, Tammy. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we do have some questions, and we'll get started with those. I have a question from Jean. Do you have advice for non-salary or contractors who don't have a weekly paycheck?
So I'm wondering what, Jean, do I have advice for non-salaried or contractors who don't? There's a lot of people out there who don't have a weekly paycheck. That's true. So I'm
Sorry.
curious what kind of advice.
Yeah, I think maybe she wanted to know how to cope and add more financial success.
Okay. So there's a couple of things. One is, of course, this sounds probably obvious. Of course, I'm assuming that you'd prefer to have full-time employment. I know a lot of people very frustrated in that space. The other thing that I've worked with people on who are finding themselves in that space is to develop some other kind of revenue stream for themselves. So not that there's always time to do that, but it takes time developing other, what we call gig work or the gig economy, right? Which you may feel like you're already a part of, but other things that don't necessarily depend directly on other people employing you, but things that are more within your own control. So depending on what your skills are or your talents are, it might be, I don't know what your skills are, so I can't suggest something specifically, but I know that there are lots of resources. Actually, in the back of my book, there are tremendous resources. My book is also available in public libraries too. You can always ask your public library to purchase my book and carry it. So I just want to make that clear as well. So there's lots of free resources there. But I would say we are living in a time where there is a lot of work like that, what you're talking about, Jean. And I think that a lot of people are having to get very creative and add a side gig, some other form of income to supplement what they're doing while they're looking for full-time work. And I would also say, don't try to do everything alone. I think there are also other resources out there that can help you develop a way to either get your foot in the door for other full-time employment. Again, I don't have a lot of information, so it's hard for me to direct you in a very specific direction. But I think that a lot of people spend a lot of time online looking at job postings and applying for jobs. And I would say your best bet is to keep talking to people, either people you know or asking other people who they might know, who might be familiar with other companies and organizations in your area that might be hiring. Word of mouth is the most powerful tool you will ever have in the job market. It is not about looking at jobs online. So I hope that gives you a few other things to look at, but I would say take a look at the resources section in the back of my book, because there's a lot of good tools there too.
Great. Lindsay had a question. She said, what if we know we're not happy in our current career, but we have absolutely no idea what we want to do?
That is a great question, Lindsay. I love that question. And I love that question. So, as a first step, what I often suggest that people do is think about First of all, think about the things that you enjoy doing. I think sometimes we don't equate work with pleasure. Now, I'm not suggesting, if you enjoy taking baths or going swimming or walking your dog, right? Although if you enjoy walking your dog, you might enjoy that as a job. But one thing that I suggest that people do when they have no idea what to do is to do an inventory first of what are the things that you know you're good at, right? Even though I just said don't focus on that, you do focus on what you're good at. And then of those things that you're good at, which of those things do you enjoy? Because I find that a lot of people oftentimes actually don't dislike their work. They usually dislike the organizational culture they're in, or they're not happy working underneath their boss or the leadership of the organization they're in. And it's not actually about the work itself. Now, that may not be true for you, Lindsay. It may be that you don't like your current career. So, a couple of things that I suggest that people do. Think about what have people thanked you for that made you feel good about yourself? What are some of the things that you do that you are left feeling good about? Make a list of those things. It takes time. Talk to other people who you know like what they're doing for work and ask them more about it. One of the things that I find that helps sort of unlock our thinking is to just take an interest in other people. Dale Carnegie said, be interested, not interesting. Sometimes when we take the focus off of ourselves, it actually gets us thinking more about ourselves. I would say start talking to a few other people about their work. What do they like about it? And maybe even what they don't like about it. Or what is it they like about either their work or their employer? And let it marinate. That might help you to start thinking about things you do like. A couple of other things I suggest that people do is think about if you walked into a bookstore, what would be the first section you would go to, or the second section? Does that tell you something about something you're interested in? Start there. Also, I highly recommend working with a career coach or a career counselor. There are all kinds of resources in a variety of communities. There are online resources. Definitely don't try to do this all by yourself or do it in your own head. The best way to start to figure these things out is by talking to other people and getting ideas and thinking about how those ideas sort of resonate within you, and let it marinate within you. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that probably did. Thank you. Nancy says that the New York Times had an article about folks having second careers, going back to school and acquiring educational debt that they are carrying into old age and retirement. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I think carrying educational debt is not a good idea. I think there's lots of other ways to get an education without taking on a lot of debt. So I think being financially smart about how you go about growing your career and your second career, if you are heading into your retirement years or your older years, I think I don't think it's a great idea. I think if you're going to take on the debt and you know how you're going to pay it off, that's a choice you're making, and go for it if you're comfortable with that. But I would say that for most people, they're probably going to be so anxious about it, it's not worth doing. There are so many resources out there for getting an education and getting the information that you need to move your career in a certain direction. Um, there are also streamlined ways to do it. There's tons of online learning now that is at a higher education university level my resources section has a whole section on this. There's edX, Coursera. Now, some of them have bought each other out. They're all taught by some of the top university professors. There are also professional certificate programs that don't necessarily require you to take an entire degree granting program. So unless you're going to go after a degree that you know is going to pay itself back in spades, I don't recommend incurring a lot of debt in your older years unless you really know how you're going to pay for it. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, great. And then I get a lot of questions sometimes. Oh, wait, we have a question from George. Let's go with this one. George says, I've been applying to a bunch of jobs, but with so many rejections, I've been getting down, even from ones that I'm qualified for. How can I work through this?
Great. George, you are not alone. So one thing I don't know if you're familiar with, but first of all, it's very competitive. We all know that. But there are a couple of things that a lot of people aren't familiar with. One is that most organizations and companies are using these screening tools that are powered by artificial intelligence called applicant tracking systems. So when people send their resumes out and they feel like they're highly qualified and they hear nothing, or they think their resume has gone into a black hole, that's because they haven't used the right keywords in their materials, and so their resume hasn't even gone through the system because they didn't have the right keywords. There are tools out there now that can help you prepare your materials so that they do go through those systems properly. One of those is called Resume Worded. So if you type in Resume Worded into Google, you will find that. That's a very good one. There's another one I'm blanking on, but Resume Worded is an excellent, excellent resource. Now, you're saying you've gotten many rejections. So the number two strategy, and it's not really second, it goes hand in hand, is whenever you see a job you're interested in, the first thing you do is you get onto LinkedIn. If you don't already off the top of your head know someone who works in that organization, go to LinkedIn, type in the name of the organization, and look to see if you have at least some second degree connections to that organization, and then look to see who in your network may potentially know somebody who works there or who used to work there. The best thing you can do is find a connection inside the organization that who you can have a conversation with. Not that you're asking them to pave the way for you to get your foot in the door, but just to start to have conversations with people inside those organizations. Relationships make the world go round. It is to some degree about who you know, especially when you're competing against a lot of other highly qualified people. That's one thing. The other thing is, if your resume is simply a chronological account of what you've done and not of your achievements in any kind of quantifiable way, that could also be a problem. You really need to make sure that your resume reflects what you've achieved and who you are. What do you like to work with? That's why connecting with other people is also very important. I'm giving you a lot of broad brushstrokes here, but these are some key points. The other way that I also suggest that people try to get to know people inside an organization is through alumni associations. How about that? Alumni associations are a great resource for getting to know people who you would be naturally connected to. And you're not asking people to do you any special favors. You're just trying to get to understand what is the organization like. And you can, sometimes a lot of organizations now have referral programs too. So if you approach somebody who works there and you say, I'm an applicant or I'm about to be an applicant, they may be willing to say, oh, well, I can put your resume through the referral program. Now, it doesn't necessarily give you a big advantage, but it does help sometimes to have a current employee refer you through. And if you get hired, they will get some financial rewards for that as well. So those are some things that you can do to increase and enhance your chances of getting through. But I will say that it's very easy to get down in the process, and you've got to do other things to help keep your spirits up as well. These are some things you can do to try to move your credentials through, but you also have to do other things, I think, to keep your spirits up, because it is a little bit of a numbers game getting yourself through places.
Great. Thank you for that. That was a wonderful answer to that question. So appreciate that. I'm sure everybody
Yeah.
else does as well. So we have come to the end of our hour already. Everybody, there is a link to Tammy's book right below the video, and also a link to the workbook that she so graciously gave us. All of her contact information is right here on the slide. So I hope that you were able to write something down to get in touch with her later if you so wish. Tammy, thank you so much for your time. And just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. And please join us next week if you have time. Next Thursday, we will be joined by Sarah Noel Wilson, best-selling author of Feeding the Elephant in the Room, How and Why We Avoid Difficult Conversations. Register, attend on the alumni homepage, and I hope to see you there. Once again, Tammy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.